Hey guys, welcome to the Catholic Show. Today we're going to talk about Fulton Sheen and his views of education. So Venerable, soon-to-be Saint Fulton Sheen was one of the most dynamic Catholic figures of the 20th century. He hosted radio and television shows that were so popular that he received 2 Emmy Awards and was even on the cover of Time magazine. But Sheen was also a professor for over 25 years, and so today we're going to look at his views on education, specifically drawing on 2 sources: his newspaper articles that he wrote on the subject, and an episode from his television show, Life Worth Living. You can find links to both in the description below for a more complete view of Sheen's perspective, but here's 3 takeaways that I had. Education must account for the whole human person. A true education, Sheen would argue, must be rooted in the truth about who the human person is, where they come from, where they're going, and what is their purpose. Sheen says, are schools and universities throughout the country that ignore God really educating the young men and women entrusted to their care? Can we say that a man is truly educated who is ignorant of the first principles of life and truth and love, which is God? You see, we wouldn't educate someone in math without first teaching them the truths about 2 plus 2 equaling 4, or subtraction or multiplication or any of that. We also wouldn't put someone in an airplane and expect them to fly it without them first knowing the truths about aerodynamics or about how to fly an airplane. But when we educate people in schools, we tend not to think about who the human person is and the truth of that being that they're rooted and created in God. This is why public education, government schooling, I'll call it, is not really sufficient for the human person to flourish. You see, it doesn't take into account what the human person needs to flourish because it doesn't take into account that God is what the human person needs to flourish. We are bodies and souls composite. We're not just people composed of atoms to become college and career ready. No, we need to strive towards our purpose, towards our end. And the purpose and the end is not to go to college and then get a job and then buy a house and then buy a bigger house and then hopefully have enough money to retire and then what? A true education would aim you in the correct direction so that you would arrive at the correct end. And the end of man is God, is the beatific vision. Now, practically speaking, what does it mean when I say that the government schools are not good for the whole human person? Well, as a teacher for 11 years of my life, I've seen what government schools and even private schools do to kids when they don't account for the soul, when they don't account for the body-soul composite, when they just treat them like some sort of economic entity. And so here's some statistics that we can look at. 25% of school children will have contemplated suicide by age 16. 67% report being bored in class every single day. 65% will have stopped being active in their faith by age 19. Only 37% will be ready for post-secondary level math and reading by their graduation date. 1 in 10 will be victims of sexual misconduct by a teacher during their career. Think about that one for a second. I'll say it again. 1 in 10 will be victims of sexual misconduct by a teacher during their career. And 19% of females aged 12 to 17 will suffer from depression. So all this goes back to the principle that Sheen talks about, where it's not actually an education unless it actually addresses the truth about who the human person is, about who God is, and that the human person was made for God. A second interesting insight that Sheen gives us about education is that courses of study should correlate to other courses of study.
You will have a correlation of studies. That is to say, one subject to be related to another subject.
You shouldn't just learn things in silos where you're studying math over here and science over here, and they never talk to each other. There's nothing that correlates between them, because that's often the way that our public government schools teach subjects. In education, there should be a scope and sequence to what students are learning that crosses over disciplines and actually complements disciplines, so that when you start out in a subject, you build on that subject throughout that student's career.
These sciences illumined the lower sciences, which is true. For example, you would not understand music unless you had mathematics.
Sheen also talks about how at the end of an education, a true education, you wouldn't have a random hodgepodge of electives and you'd call that equal to someone else's random hodgepodge of electives. and say that both educations are equal. No, if you were really educating someone, you would have a goal in mind of what they ought to be at the end of that education, and then if they achieved that, they would earn the degree or the diploma or whatever it might be. So for instance, when you go into a high school, when you matriculate into a high school and you have all these classes that you can take, very often you have required courses and then you have elective courses. And so for those elective courses, you can take things like power volleyball or swimming or water sports or drawing or photography or small gas engines or all these different courses. But Sheen would say, why is it that at the end of their academic career, when we add up all those courses, that someone who took power volleyball is given the same diploma as someone who took advanced calculus 5? Or someone that took underwater basket weaving is given the same amount of credit as someone that took a study hall or became a teacher's assistant. Like, the education is not the same. So for an education system to be coherent and to be true, it ought to have a goal in mind, and it ought to educate people towards that end. And where it's deficient towards that end, then it would not count, or it wouldn't be at least credited for those classes. Very often it seems like we just give students credit for time they spent in school instead of what they actually learned in school. And I think that's what Sheen is getting at here. We ought to have a goal in mind for education, and in as much as students meet that goal, then we give them the diploma or the certificate or whatever it would be. The third takeaway is that we should have different types of school for different types of students. Now, this one I think is pretty interesting. So what Sheen says here is that we ought to have two different types of schools. One that's called standard, and the other that would be an honors school. Sheen says that the purpose of division would be to prevent the leveling down of education to a point where the dumb and the mediocre have the same classes and take the same amount of time as the learned and the industrious. We do more in America for the delinquent than for the intellectual. I love that quote. And he goes on to say more. He says that for juvenile delinquents who have been guilty of repeated serious offenses, they should be sent to a camp for a period of 1 to 2 years or more. In the camp, there would be a combination of education and hard outdoor work, both under Army discipline. I love that quote too. You see, in American education today, what we have is a system of no child left behind. And what that means practically for teachers is that we can't move ahead. No, we can only move ahead as fast as the slowest student. And when we talk about slow students, when I'm talking about slow students, I mean, in my experience, that these are often the ones that are the most misbehaved students. Fulton Sheen would call them the delinquents of the bunch. Right? When I'm in charge of a class of 30 students and 4 students are, being disruptive and holding back everyone else, what happens is that the classroom is so disruptive that the best students, or the most industrious students, as Sheen would say, they can't get the education that they need to reach their capacity and reach their potential. And so I love what Sheen is saying here, how we need to have different types of education for different students. So there you have it, 3 what I think are very interesting ideas that Fulton Sheen brings up about education. And if you like those ideas and you like this video, then don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe button and stop back for more of these videos.